You are watching the lesson Introduction to Power CLI. This is a part of the VMware vSphere Power CLI training course. In this lesson, we're going to talk about several things, starting with what is Power CLI. Then we're going to move on to how does Power CLI work. I'm going to show you how to download and install the toolkit. And lastly, we're going to look at the Power CLI console. Let's talk about what is Power CLI. Power CLI is a product that VMware released in September of 2008. It was initially called the VI Toolkit for Windows. This previous name is very descriptive, so let's analyze what it means. The first word, VI, and that stands for Virtualization Infrastructure. That refers to what is now, of course, called vSphere. This means the product is aimed at VMware's enterprise virtualization offerings, primarily ESX and vCenter server products. Next is the word toolkit. That's what Power CLI is really all about. It's a big bag of tricks that you can use to automate all kinds of operations in your vSphere environment. To be specific, we're talking about a scripting toolkit. Lastly is the phrase for Windows. PowerShell is where the Windows part comes in. PowerShell is Microsoft's new object-oriented scripting language and command shell. Its syntax is reminiscent of both Perl and C#. Like Perl, you have access to strong regular expression support and a flexible syntax. But like Microsoft's C#, you have the concept of object-oriented programming. There are plenty of differences as well, but we'll go over those in an upcoming video. Another feature of PowerShell is its modularity. You extend PowerShell by adding snap-ins or modules to a PowerShell script or interactive section. Power CLI itself is implemented as a snap-in, and once installed in your workstation or server, you can access the functionality it provides. PowerShell, and by extension Power CLI, comes in two forms. The first and most obvious is the interactive shell. This is the standard text console window that admins have been using since before there was a GUI. You can sit in this shell and perform commands to browse your file system, examine your computer, or execute commands. As such, it works similarly to the old command.exe. However, at the same time, PowerShell is also a scripting engine. You can take a series of commands and place them into a file with a PS1 extension. When you use PowerShell to execute this script, each of these commands is then run as per your instructions. This means PowerShell works like VBScript and a command shell. When you think about a command shell, sometimes a distinction is made is whether these commands are executed locally, as with command, or remotely, as with SSH. Due to the way that VMware designed their API, which I'll talk more about in a minute, Power CLI is able to remotely control your vSphere environment. As long as you have network access to your server, you can automate them. Basically, if you can use the vSphere client, you should be able to connect to that environment via Power CLI. The last thing I want to mention here about Power CLI is a theme that you will hear me repeating often, and that's the task-oriented nature of PowerShell. We're going to get into this later on when talking about commandlets, but understand that PowerShell was primarily created for admins, not developers, although there are plenty of cases to be made for them as well. In fact, Jeffrey Snover, the architect in charge of PowerShell, has often said that it's made for admins with their hair on fire. What he means is that you have problems to solve now, and it's extremely difficult to devote time to learning a new scripting language. Microsoft knows this, so PowerShell was designed to put action at your fingertips. The syntax of PowerShell and its task-oriented commandlets ensure that you'll be able to get a lot of work done without a lot of typing. Now let's talk a little bit about how Power CLI works. You may have seen this slide before. It's straight from VMware. This shows the virtualization stack, and specifically in this case, how the vSphere application programming interface can tie into any part of that stack. Power CLI, as represented by this icon, uses the very same API as the graphical vSphere client with which you're already familiar. The vSphere API is a web service. By default, this means that you'll be using port 443 on an ESX server when creating a connection to it. You can use this connection from Power CLI to do practically anything. Of course, in the real world, you're often not using ESX servers in a standalone environment. Once your environment grows beyond a certain size, you'll want to invest in tools to help with management tasks. That's why vCenter exists to help tackle the increased maintenance needs when you have multiple host servers. Well, PowerCLI definitely scales to meet these same needs. Using the vSphere Web Service API, you connect, again over port 443, to a vCenter server and can instantly take advantage of its features such as templates or vMotion. Now I'm going to show you where you can go to download the toolkit. Now, if you're not running Windows 7 or 2008 R2, you'll need to make sure that PowerShell is installed in your system. You can find the latest version of PowerShell at microsoft.com/PowerShell. Once you've downloaded and installed PowerShell, if necessary, it's time to do the same for PowerCLI. You can find the latest version of the toolkit at vmware.com/go/PowerCLI. While both PowerShell and PowerCLI are very easy to install, the order of installation is important. Go ahead and install PowerShell first. There are no special options required during install, and it's completed pretty quickly. No reboot is required either, which is always great. PowerCLI is just as straightforward to install. Once you've got that done, check your Start menu for these shortcuts. Now that you have PowerCLI installed, I want to talk about what these shortcuts on the Start menu do. When you click on the PowerCLI shortcut in your Start menu, what happens is that PowerShell.exe is given two different initialization instructions. The first instruction is called a console file, and in it is specified the name of the PowerShell snap-in to load when PowerShell starts. A snap-in is a set of commandlets and other PowerShell features which can be added to a console session. A snap-in is contained within a .NET assembly, which is just a DLL, and it must be installed before PowerShell can use it. The shortcut also invokes an initialization script. This script, as you may have seen before, displays a few lines of helpful text at the top of the PowerCLI window. The point I'm trying to make here is that once installed, the PowerCLI commandlets can be used outside of this shortcut. If you're going to run your own scripts, you need to understand how this mechanism works so that you can load the snap-ins as needed. We'll probably touch on this more later. For now, it's sufficient to understand that the PowerCLI console isn't special. It's just a PowerShell window with a couple of extra options specified. So this is the PowerCLI window. It looks a lot like command.exe, to be honest, but trust me, there's a lot under the hood. Before we continue, I want to point out a few features. Once you open PowerCLI from the Start menu shortcut, you are greeted with several important notes at the top of the console window. Each of these strings in yellow, such as get VM, is a commandlet. A commandlet is a perfect example of the task-oriented nature of PowerShell, and we'll be talking about them throughout this whole video series. To the left of the commandlet names is a brief description of what that commandlet does. Let me list them real quick. Connect VI server, get VI command, get PowerCLI help, get VM, and get PowerCLI community. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, and as I said, we're going to be going through these extensively throughout the videos. I also want to mention a couple of special features related to your prompt. You can see down here the text vSphere PowerCLI. It appears in green before the current working directory. This is to remind you that you are in a PowerCLI session, as opposed to the PowerShell window where you don't have the PowerCLI snap-in loaded. And lastly, note that in the title bar, you'll see the words not connected. This text will change accordingly after connecting to your vSphere environment, so that's a great way to quickly see your connection status, including your vCenter or ESX server name. So that's it for this introductory lesson. What we covered, we started in with what is PowerCLI, and you learned about what the toolkit is and some of the purposes behind it. Then we talked about how PowerCLI works. Then I showed you how to download and install the toolkit from Microsoft.com and VMware.com. And lastly, you got a glimpse of what the PowerCLI console looks like.